First suspected we might have a problem of some sort in about January 2019 when two panels behind us over here showed very, very weak growth. Everything else around them was strong and looking healthy, but these two panels had yellowing coloured leaves and shoots that were probably only a foot high. We had a viticultural consultant come to have a look at it. He did warn us that it does have the normal early signs of Phylloxera. It's a diagnosis of cancer that your vineyard is going to die. It's an incurable cancer, if you like. And I actually had cancer, which I've been cured from years ago. Unfortunately, there is no cure, for Phylloxera. You just have to let it, run its course and start work again from the beginning. I'm in my mid-50s. Do you want to start again? Or do you exit the industry? And I think a lot of people find that a very hard decision to make.
When Phylloxera is first found on a grower's property, it's a highly emotive time. A lot of the emotions that will come out are centred around embarrassment, I suppose, and possibly shame. It's not necessarily correct, but there's a stigma attached with Phylloxera. So the social impact of an incursion on a region is interesting in the sense that it becomes a reputational risk, more so from other parts of the industry, other regions within the area, rather than focusing on what the opportunity is in terms of being able to move forward. It's viewed as a potential way of spreading that pest to other areas. The subsequent detections after that aren't quite as socially and emotionally as poor, but the first person carries the weight of that initial detection. So we'd hope that that's not something that would deter people from actually making a report because of that emotional burden that can come with it. When the grower starts to become, probably more familiar with that incursion or that detection, then it can start looking at feelings like anger as to where it might have come from, and eventually it becomes they lead themselves to resignation and they move on and how they can then deal with the problem.
Phylloxera is newly detected in the region. It's a big shock to the system, no doubt about it. It takes some operations to the wall if they don't have the cash flow to fund a total replant and things like that. So, it's a very serious thing to deal with, and you can't underestimate the impact on a growing community mentally as well as just financially.
What we're faced with really is a very extensive job in ripping out those vines there. What we're going to have to do is, at pruning time, essentially cut off all the arms, cut off the stumps, and then we're going to have to go through and basically rip those rows again in order to remove the roots and to allow us to replant. And the process of doing that's going to disturb the whole trellising system. It's going to disturb the irrigation system. And then once we're through that whole process, we've got to go through with the replanting. Now, replanting requires us to replant on rootstock. It has to be grafted. And because of the spread of Phylloxera and how virulent it is in the Yarra Valley, there is waiting lists to get the material that you need to graft onto, the rootstock that's required to graft to. That's an expensive exercise, and it's also a slow exercise. Then once we've got that grafted material, then we'll have to have the labour to come in to replant the vines and rework the vines and retrain them as they grow and develop until we can eventually get produce from them again in many years.
If you look at the anecdotal feedback that we've got out of the Yarra in relation to the impact on some of the growers that have gone to own roots, it's been significant replanting costs and significant costs associated with changing their management practices within their vineyards. And I think if you'd gone back to a lot of the viticulturalists we've dealt with over the last 2 or 3 years and said, well, look, if we'd done something different 10 years ago and we didn't have to do what we're doing now, I think you'd see that a lot of them would look at it and go, well, my farm plant protection, my farm hygiene, my biosecurity is really important.
So the initial incursion will have probably the greatest implications on the grower's business. Once you become part of a Phylloxera infested zone, it reduces your ability to trade. So you can only trade with people who are also within that area. So you're not able to send fruit to a Phylloxera exclusion zone, as an example. If you're a winery within that area, you then have to look at process heat treating your equipment, heat treating your bins. There's a lot of procedural steps that need to be put through to make sure that you have adequate sanitation to be able to deal with people outside of the zone. Within your own operation, hygiene certainly needs to be increased to manage the biosecurity issues that you have, but realistically, good hygiene should already be in place anyway.
If you're leasing a block and you're trying to move machinery across the declared area, then there are compliance costs. And depending on how familiar they are to you, they can be problematic. It's all of a sudden, there's a set of rules basically enforcing treatment conditions that are risk-based, but they can be quite onerous. That's where we see a little bit of frustration coming back from industry into the department.
So there are costs in managing Phylloxera or any other pests, whether it's through an eradication program, whether it's through on-property management programs, or whether it's other jurisdictions imposing regulation on businesses that businesses have to comply with. But to decrease the cost, to manage costs more effectively, it's important that we detect anything as soon as possible. If we can do that, if we can carry out the initial investigation and think, oh, this is largely contained to this really small area, then it doesn't become widespread, costs don't become as big, and if we can eradicate, certainly initial costs for eradication, but then we don't have a pest in the system. So the costs to do nothing far outweigh costs to get in early and respond immediately in the long run.
The issue that my industry, the wider horticultural industry experiences is not the actual damage that Phylloxera is going to cause to their product, but how the many sort of actors and agencies and jurisdictions perceive these incursions and the feelings of uncertainty and anxiety and frustration that are generated as a result, both in the shorter and longer term. And that's through regulatory or compliance action and interaction with other jurisdictions and industries. With any Phylloxera zone changes, attention will be drawn to those grapevines growers, wholesalers and retailers who send out of or into these designated zones. And this has been long understood. And as a result, the industry has sort of voluntarily avoided growing grapevines for amenity purpose, despite it being a potentially lucrative market for them. And this is due to the uncertainty of maintaining that market post-incursion, especially after investing so much time and money into that. When you place a term like infested over a grower's property, regardless of the physical presence of the pest or a host, that word itself can still influence decisions and actions that can limit or sort of hamper movement, or at the very least threaten as much.
Tend to overstate the long-term impact and the global impact of these things as well. I think we're heavily invested in things like old vines and the notion of own roots being superior to a vine that's grafted onto a rootstock. Those sorts of things, we need to step back and take a new look and understand how the global system of viticulture works and how well companies in Europe, for instance, have adapted and command very high prices for making wines that are from vines that are grafted to rootstocks.
But I think what they realise at some point is that this is manageable as well. So like I'm not trying to discount it. It's really important to make sure we keep it out. Prevention is always better than cure, because you can't cure once you've got it. But then I think that people who have really got a forward-looking mindset really look at, well, okay, what are the opportunities here? I need to get onto a replanting program at some stage, because my vines will eventually be infected and die. My own rooted vines will be problematic. So, really looking at those that now are forward-thinking and using that as an opportunity to redevelop and actually position themselves for the future.
If we look at rootstock versus own roots in an area that already has Phylloxera in it, for example, the Yarra Valley, there may not be any added value for having rootstocks or a proportion of your vineyard with rootstocks on rootstocks, but it's a much less risky proposition for somebody to lend money against it. It's a reduction in risk more so than an increase in value. So you're never guaranteed, unfortunately, in agriculture about getting a return. But if you have Phylloxera-resistant rootstocks, the longevity of your vineyard will be higher and better than if you're on your own roots. And that's where the advantage comes.
Rootstocks currently used in Australia are bred using characteristics of rootstocks in overseas, that is Europe, where Phylloxera devastated the vines in the late 1800s. They were not bred to the Australian conditions. Future research will go into doing some screening with rootstocks using Australian conditions, where we are going to take into account the soil and climate characteristics, because it has been shown recently that though it has been known that sandy soils do not allow Phylloxera to develop, recent studies coming out from Washington State is showing that actually Phylloxera does develop and reproduce on sandy soils. And we have also shown that in our research here. So what we're going to do is build into all these characteristics that are durable and have resistance across multiple genetic strains in Australia, so that we can provide information to the growers based on the climate conditions and also looking at temperature and soil interactions.
Prior to the outbreak of Phylloxera in the Yarra region before 2006, I think the attitude towards biosecurity was always pretty lax. People sort of walked around. They knew about Phylloxera, of course, it's been around for a long time, but it was someone else's problem. Some of the bigger companies absolutely understood some of the implications of it, but certainly some of the smaller producers around the Yarra, thought it was someone else's problem and didn't think that it was up to them to, have any real requirements to change any of their business practices around that. I think the other thing for me is, I can tell you now, on every one of their minds is we need to make sure we don't spread it to other regions. So I just want to say that the leadership that's been shown within the Yarra region on that particular aspect I think has been amazing as well. Making sure that they're not going to spread to other regions and making sure that they're looking at managing this responsibly. They don't want to be tarred with the brush of being the spread.
I think it's important to remember that entangled within the politics, trade and the prescriptive logic behind regulations and the goals of good biosecurity, there are people, and that's at the core. And sometimes their decision to do or not do something that encourages the spread of plant pests can have an effect on those that don't deserve to be affected by an incursion.
Recent studies have shown that some Phylloxera forms are found in significantly high numbers on what has been known as resistant rootstocks. And these studies in Australia match some of the studies that have come out from Europe and California in the last 2 years, where these studies deduced that some Phylloxera forms could be evolving and becoming better adapted to rootstocks. These studies just emphasize why keeping up with a good biosecurity measure for growers that still have Phylloxera is quite important.
What can the other regions learn from the Yarra Valley case study? I think it's absolutely the farm gate biosecurity message and just incorporating that into their normal business practice. Don't get me wrong, a lot of the businesses and regions around Australia have heard that before, but really seriously adopting that and making that part of the normal business process and part of the culture of the region is the most important thing that we've really seen out of the Yarra here. And I'd encourage all the other regions to really take that very seriously, and all the other businesses to take that seriously.
We've done a pretty good job, I think, Victoria, in containing this pest for the last couple of decades. Now, that doesn't mean we don't get the occasional detection, which we have this season. So the lesson to learn is that we have to keep engaging and working with industry, affected parties, to remind them we do have this pest that's under containment, but it's just that constant working with industry to remind them that this is where we're at. Keep up the good biosecurity practice and to continue working with us and talking to us if they have any concerns about what Phylloxera means to them and what the impacts are to them.
Phylloxera kind of sometimes confounds us a little bit, and we focus too much on it. Unfortunately, I think it's made us a little bit more relaxed in other aspects of biosecurity, and so we need to try and change the conversation and the discussion about biosecurity so that we don't always just go directly to Phylloxera every time. It's one type of pest, but there's so many other pests that we need to guard against and protect our national vineyard from. If you just take the standard biosecurity measures and make them part of your routine, everyday operating procedures, then we'll all be better off.
Well, and biosecurity is one. It's an insurance policy of your investment in your vineyard and your own asset that you've got there. It'd be crazy not to try to look after that asset and protect it from a foreign invader like Phylloxera. Also, it can affect your neighbours, and it affects the livelihood, the financial position of people, and can destroy their livelihood. A lot of us have got neighbours who we love and cherish and work together with. We don't want to see that happen to them, even if we're on rootstock and they're not. We don't want to promote an environment here on our property that's going to be conducive to spreading Phylloxera throughout the whole region or neighbourhood that we're in. It's a matter of protecting your own asset and also protecting the other assets of the industry.